welcome to the Marina Skua Podcast. It's a new month, a new year, a new decade, and I, for one, am really excited to see what that brings. I have spent the last few weeks planning and taking stock and looking at the last year and seeing what I'm going to be doing in the coming year. I know a lot of people like to use New Year as a time to do similar. Some people really don't like that as a marker because it sets all kind of expectations. I like it mostly because January does feel like a fresh start. The days are beginning to get longer. Although we've still had a lot of very cloudy days like today, we occasionally have had a stunner with sultry morning mists and loads of frost that have then boiled off into glorious blue icy days, which I've really been loving. Things are just beginning to wake up in the garden, and that brings me enormous amounts of hope, which I always really enjoy. And so I use that awakening as a time to think about what I'm going to be doing and how I can use some of that energy. And so I'm not going to be making any upheavals. I am going to be introducing a few exciting things this year, and I hope that you will be interested to hear about them. This month I don't have any finished objects to show you. It feels quite weird because I actually, the year before last year, I started a little tradition where on the 1st of January I lay out all of my finished objects from the last year. I lay them out on the floor and I take a look at the things I've been knitting. I notice some trends that you don't really spot until they're all together. It's always interesting to see a colour palette emerge. Last year for me it was quite a bit of grey and cool soft bluey greeny tones with little highlights of warm apricots and orange, and that was quite nice to see because the previous year had been just overwhelmingly orange and brown and lots of very warm colours. It's always fun to see how that turns out. But yes, I don't have a finished object to show you. I did finish something over Christmas, but as I mentioned last time, it's for a publication, so you'll have to wait a few months to see what that is. I have a couple of new works in progress to show you. I've not made any progress on the previous ones, which is a bit terrible, and I feel like I need to go back and work on them a little bit, just so that they don't feel abandoned. One of them is officially in hibernation until at least spring, and so that's fine. Then there are a couple of things that I just haven't really felt motivated to work on much. So I shall show you the two new things, and then hopefully once I've got those out the way, I will begin to try and get the other ones going, because I don't like to have things hanging around for too long. Sometimes things get put in the naughty corner. That's not really the case with these. Righty-ho, so the first one. My husband is getting rather used to receiving his Christmas presents in a some assembly required type format. So it tends to be a bag of yarn and a sketch of what I'm going to make for him, and this year was no different. I am making a yoked jumper for him out of Mendip DK. These are very much his colours. He looks excellent in blue and grey. This is, the main colour is the natural sheep colour, which is a blend of the natural white and naturally dark, almost black lamb's wool. And those blended together give a really nice heathery grey. And then the contrast colour is a dyed colour called Sky, which is a really nice, rich royal blue. And I'm really pleased with how this is turning out. If you have been watching the podcast for a long time, for probably at least a year, about that. You might recognise the colourwork pattern, which is the same as a white and very dark green one I did back a while ago, which was a bit of a saga. I ripped back quite a few times, and even when I finished, I wasn't happy with it. Partially because I was a bit slapdash in the planning of the project, and I was doing a fly by the seat of your pants type approach, which occasionally works quite well, but for garments where fit is important, it doesn't. So this time I'm winging it a lot less. I've done an enormous amount of planning, and fingers crossed that means it's going to be a beautifully fitting thing. You can probably see this is much bigger than I am used to knitting. It's just very strange because I pretty much exclusively knit garments for myself. And my husband has much broader shoulders than me, which means that this is quite a few sizes larger. And so it's just taking longer to do everything. I am now at the stage where I'm about to split for the sleeves and the body. Then they will be the plain grey, and then there will be a repeat of the colour work at the wrists and waist. So it's going to be fairly ornate, but luckily he can pull it off. I'll just put it on to show you, because this is the delight. You can see how not at all Marina size that is. Doesn't mean I'm not going to occasionally steal it for warms, because it's really nice and toasty. Like, this is quite amusing. That's basically a jumper on me already. But yes, so I'm having loads of fun with this. It's on 4mm needles. Is that true? Or is it 4.5? I can check right now. It is 4mm needles, that makes sense. It's a DK weight yarn, so it's at the thicker end of needles that you would use for this yarn. But that means that it's zooming along quite nicely. I cast that on, I think on the 1st of January. And so that's about 3 weeks worth of work, which is really pleasing. So I'm making that one as my participation in the Out of the Dark make-along, which I talked about in the last episode, which is still running and will be until the end of March. So there I'm using my own yarn, as well as what will be my own pattern, but doesn't really count as a pattern yet because it's not available. However, it will be. I'm hoping that I'll have it ready to release in time for autumn. I'm not going to hurry it. I'm not going to try to release it in the middle of summer because that doesn't really make sense. But yes, I'm hoping to release that one, and I am putting in the prep work to ensure that it will be publishable. So far there have been lots of people taking part in the make-along, which is just really exciting. It's so lovely to see what everyone's making, whether it's my patterns that they're picking yarns for. Some people have dyed and spun their own yarn to make some of my patterns, which is just so gratifying. And then some people are using my yarn to make bigger projects. There's a cardigan going on and a really beautiful shawl. Do take a look at the Out of the Dark MAL hashtag on Instagram, and there is a thread on Ravelry which I will link to you. If you want to join in, that would be delightful. There will be prizes at the end. We've got a few participants now, so I'm going to make sure that we've got some really nice prizes for people who participate. And yes, by that stage, the clocks will have changed and we'll be well underway with spring. And yeah, the next thing is I think I'm going to show you this a bit closer up because it's quite tiny. I'm just beginning a pair of fingerless mitts with some sort of new yarn. Just over a year ago, I released this range of yarn here, which is Kaya Baby Alpaca, which is a range of 5 variegated colours dyed on baby alpaca yarn from a small alpaca farm just north of the Mendip hills. So that's about, I think it's about 18 miles from where I live. I can drive there in 45 minutes because with my yarns I like to source the fibre as locally as I possibly can and have them from a single source and be able to visit where the fibre comes from, know the conditions that the animals are kept in, and have that traceable element to it to make sure that I have control over the origins of my products. And so this is the original range of 5 variegated colours, and now I am working on a range of complementary semi-solid colours, of which this is one. The colours are all going to be nice, deep, rich shades, fairly sultry ones, quite saturated but not garish. And so I'm going to have the new colours available in a few weeks' time, and I'll definitely have them at Unravel. And I am just making a pair of fingerless mitts just to show off this yarn, because I've made a shawl out of this colour before and it's completely lovely for shawls, but I want to show that it's also nice for things that aren't shawls. It's a very fine yarn, so I'm knitting these cuffs on a 2mm needle. I'll then switch to a 3mm needle for the main body, which is for the main hand part. There'll be a little thumb gusset and it'll just be straight across a fingerless mitt. And I'll have mostly stockinette with probably a little bit of a lacy detail on there. And so, I don't know how well you can see, it's got a lovely spring to it. Like, there is a tendency to think of alpaca as being quite floppy and structureless, which I think is deeply unfair. It does have a lovely drape to it, but in this ribbing here, that is super bouncy, and it's got a lovely springiness to it. It also has a really pleasing halo, and so it's got a really nice softness. And I tend to shy away from knitting really, really fine. I have to sort of ration projects out to make sure that I don't get bored spending ages and ages and ages on something that's growing very, very slowly. But this is progressing nicely. I only started these last night at knit night. And so they've gone quite nicely. I'll expect to finish them within a couple of weeks. You can see this colour works really nicely with this variegated one. And so I've sort of designed the range so that each of the solid colours will pair beautifully with one of the variegated ones. And I'll be revealing the full range of colours fairly soon. The best way to find out about those will be to subscribe to my newsletter, because that will be the first place where I announce the launch of the yarns. And I've already had a fair bit of interest from people who have seen sneaky peeks of colours that I've shown already, which is quite exciting. And so yes, if you join the newsletter, you will get a little email letting you know when the yarn is available. And if you don't want to join the newsletter, you can follow me on Instagram. I tend to distrust Instagram for announcements like this recently, just because often you'll see something and be excited about it and realise it's 3 days ago and it's already sold out, or whatever it's talking about is no longer relevant, which is somewhat disappointing, but it's the way it is. I'm also going to be putting together a little video of the process for dyeing one of the new colours for my Patreon page. I don't know if you're familiar with Patreon, but it is a subscription-based channel where you can sign up for a small amount every month, and I post bonus content on there for subscribers, so they'll get discount codes to use on my shop and Ravelry page, and they get behind the scenes looks at things that I tend not to share on the podcast. And so with this, I will be sharing my dyeing process, which I don't tend to do for my regular colour ranges of yarn, because I share a fair amount of my process, but there are some things that I like to be a little bit cagey about. So if you want the proper behind the scenes look into how I dye my yarns, the processes involved, and how I mix my colours, then do take a look over on Patreon. I'll put a little link, because I've had loads of fun coming up with the colours so far. The range is all planned out, and it's, hopefully it'll be interesting for people to see how I get from concept to the actual yarn. So those are the things I am currently actively knitting. Hopefully those will both be finished fairly soon, and I will have both of them with me at Unravel. If you're coming to Unravel, which is the penultimate weekend in February, so I think it's around the 20th, 21st, and it's in Farnham in Surrey, outside London. And I am very excited to be attending, because I have been as a visitor before. It's a lovely show. I used to live very close to Farnham, and it's really, really exciting to be exhibiting this time, because I have applied a few times previously and not got in. And so it's really, really pleasing, because it means I'll be able to, as well as meet a lot of new people, I'll be able to catch up with my old knitting group, which will be delightful. So if you are going to Unravel, do come along and say hello. It'll be really, really lovely to meet you. And with that, I received some other yarn from John Arbon. It's called Yarnadelic and is inspired by John's record collection. The team took some time to sit, drink some wine, listen to some music, and come up with colours inspired by the songs that they were listening to, which I think is just such a cool way to come up with a colour scheme. Like, I really enjoy themed colours. I do that with my colour ranges. I try to put together a cohesive, interesting range and have names inspired by a theme. I find that helps me to pull together a nice range, and the team at John Arbon have definitely done that. They sent me a couple of mini skeins to try out prior to the release of the yarn, and I thought I would just show you some of my swatches and chat a bit about the yarn itself. With the Yarnadelic, I really wanted to take the time to get to know the yarn well, because sometimes a yarn can surprise you with how it turns out in certain stitch patterns. And so I thought I would just do a few swatches to see what it's nicely suited for. And I have to say, I think by far my favourite is the cables. It has a really nice definition to the stitches without being too harsh and crispy looking. It was definitely fairly crispy. I hope you know what I mean by crispy, when it's the yarn is very compact and doesn't have much bloom or softness to it visually. Like when it blooms, it tends to blur a little bit. But before this was blocked, it looked quite sharp, very, very defined edges. But then when I soaked it, the stitches all eased up beautifully, and so there's still really nice stitch definition, especially in this one. I think this has worked out lovely. Just a little diamondy eyelet pattern there. But that has worked particularly nicely for the cables, and I really like how they've turned out in this heathery yarn. So here you can see a bit of that stitch definition and how it's not harsh, but the cables show really beautifully, and the heathery colours are just gorgeous. And then this one. I really like how just that really simple eyelet pattern has broken up the stockinette to show off the heathery shades in the yarn. And then I'm terrible at swatching colour work in the round. This one ended up not having quite as much contrast as I expected. There is a decent amount of contrast between the colours, but I think for a colourwork design I would want a slightly larger scale pattern that would show up a bit better. I do actually really like this detail at the top here, just where these V's turn into stripes. I quite like how that's turned out. And this is just me scribbling colourwork patterns in a notebook and then knitting them up. It's nice to do swatches for that so that I don't have to use it for a whole design. And then one of my favourites is a two-coloured moss or seed stitch, which I've used in a few designs. And I just love how that texture's come out. It's beautiful. If you've been watching for a while, you probably know that as well as being very excited about making new things, I am a bit compulsive about knitting new stuff. I also believe strongly in looking after the things you already have. So with my clothes, they are generally either handmade, and I try to be very careful about the materials I choose, with my own yarns as well as with yarns I buy. I pretty much only buy second-hand for things that I'm not going to make myself, other than like underwear and stuff, because ew. But yeah, so that means that I have a lot of clothes that are really quite old, which I really like. I have a lot of hand-me-downs. The shirt I'm wearing under this jumper is one that was my grandfather's. It's a really nice wool blend shirt, so it's really toasty and warm. I mean, a lot of the time I end up looking like an amateur dramatic society needed to come up with a costume for a gardener. But yes, I do like old menswear. They tend to be really high quality. They don't go in as much for the fast fashion thing. And it's just a look that I particularly enjoy. So as well as things of my grandfather's, I have a few jumpers of my father's. They're mostly ones that he tried to throw away to give to the charity shop, and there was a big pile of them just in the hall in our house when I was growing up. And I raided them, of course. And this one is one of my very favourites. It used to be much bigger. I've shrunk it a few times in the wash to make it a little bit more Marina sized, but it's still a bit oversized. It's a case where it's not a colour that really suits me. It makes me look quite unwell generally. But it is one of my very favourite jumpers. It's been darned quite a few times. Sometimes quite neatly, sometimes fairly quickly and poorly. And in some places the darns are unravelling. I'm going to show you up a little bit more closely. What I'm going to be doing today is the cuffs are beginning to fray, both of them, and while this is never really going to be a neat jumper, just from the number of times it's been darned, it got moth-eaten at one point. Now it's just, I wear it a lot and so it's wearing through. So I am just going to stitch up the edges of the cuffs, and I'm going to do it in quite a deliberate, visible way, because I do think visible mending immediately makes things a lot more casual, unless done very, very carefully, and you have a certain style anyway. My style tends to be super casual, so it's fine. But I'm going to be doing a little bit of visible mending just on the cuffs, and I'm going to show you how I do that. I have my cuff ready to go here. You can probably see it's got little bits of paint on the edges there. It's beginning to fray, and that's just from hard wear on it, because this tends to be a jumper I wear around the house for gardening and things. But I do want it to last. I did consider simply folding the cuffs back to the inside and then stitching them so I have a new edge there, but I'd rather keep the length of the sleeves and just reinforce the edge there. So I have picked out a few yarn leftovers from one of my trusty scrap bags. I have a lot of these bags. I've mentioned in previous episodes that both my local yarn shop and a good friend of mine who lives in my city, they both give me yarn scraps from little leftovers from projects, and you know, the little ties around skeins that you take off when you're winding it into a ball. So I end up with lots of these bags, and I tend to use them for darning. The shorter bits, I need to do a sorting session, and then I want to spin them up into like weird chunky art yarn. I think that'll be really fun. But for now, I have picked out a few yarns. I'm going to go for a contrasting colour. I'm not trying to match the red of the jumper, just because I think it'll be quite fun to have a different colour on here. I've picked out a few yarns that I have enough of that could be suitable. And I'm just going to decide and explain my reasoning. So this blue one, I really enjoy the colour of. I think that goes really nicely with that red, sort of fairly primary colour look. It's not necessarily a blue that I would wear a large amount of. I prefer a slightly more greeny blue. But with the red, I quite like that. However, this is very soft. I don't know what any of these yarns are because they are just given to me in a big bag. And so I tend to just judge the yarns by how they feel and what my sort of limited but okay knowledge of yarn construction. So this one is fairly loosely spun, and also it's very soft, both of which mean that it's not going to be particularly durable. What I'm looking for here, because the cuff there is quite a high wear area, if I was just mending a hole or something on the body of the jumper, I wouldn't worry nearly as much about it being durable. But because I want it to last, I'm going to pick sort of with the same qualities in mind as you would pick for a sock yarn. So this one I'm going to dismiss because it's too loosely spun and it's probably a bit soft. So sorry you. Next, this one. Again, I really love this colour combination. It's a lot more earthy. It goes with a lot of the things I wear. But again, you can probably see there, that is very loosely spun. So although that is a lovely yarn, I probably want double the amount of twist as it actually has. So bye-bye you. And then this one, this really dark purple here, I'm very keen on. Actually, it looks a bit more brown on the camera there, but yeah, I think that is beautiful with the red. It's sort of fairly nice contrast, but isn't as harsh as if it were a black or a really dark grey. This has a reasonable amount of twist and would probably be quite suitable. I suspect, because I recognise this yarn and I know where it's come from, I suspect this is Walcott Yarn's Opus, which is a merino and alpaca blend, and it's a gorgeous yarn. I'm probably not going to use it for that reason, just because again, it's not going to be super durable. Like, it would be okay. I don't think it would wear through in a heartbeat, but I'm not necessarily looking for a really soft yarn. And similar with this one, it's sort of got a reasonable amount of twist. It looks like it might be woolen spun though, and I'm not after woolen spun. Woolen spun isn't nearly as strong. If someone tells you that you can use a woolen spun yarn for socks, be skeptical of that person. And you know, you can use it, but you will probably have to darn it, because woolen spun yarns just tend to wear through faster. That's just how that goes. And then I'm left with these ones, and this one, I really like the yarn. I would quite like to use a variegated one like this. However, I think something about the colour combination of this brown being fairly orangey isn't really doing it for me. I'm not quite sure why. It's sort of not quite enough contrast, but also it doesn't match particularly well, so I'm going to reject that one as well. Then we're left with these ones. That one's quite a little bit. That's probably not enough. I think I got these because I thought they were the same when I pulled them out, but they're not. This one's got a lighter turquoise in it, and it has little bits of brown, whereas this is a more tealy colour and has navy as the darker colour. So I'm going to reject that one because there's possibly not enough of it. And then we're down to these two. Now both have not very high twist, but quite high twist. This one actually has a decent amount of twist, and I suspect both will probably be merino. By the look of this one, definitely, I'd say that one's definitely not a straight merino. I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what that is. I think both of those are going to be suitable. And so then it comes down to what I want to use. So they're both quite different looks. That's a lot more contrast. and is really quite fun. This one's a bit thicker and higher twist. I think I'm going to go for the slightly more boring option and go for this sort of beigey brown, not quite tan colour. There's a little bit of pink in there, which I quite like. Yeah, let's be boring. Yeah, I'm going to use this one. So what I'm going to do is just pull off a length that's going to be not annoying to knit with. Snap that. That was quite difficult to snap, which is a good sign, because it means it's a nice strong yarn. I mean, that's fundamentally a very easy test for how good a yarn is going to be for something where you need a bit more durability. Just try and snap it, and I mean, don't do that in shops, but if you try to snap it and it's difficult, that probably means it's going to wear fairly well. I'm using a fairly enormous darning needle. I don't know about you, but I buy my darning needles in sets, so usually you get a larger one and then a couple of smaller ones. The smaller ones always vanish and I don't know where they go, so I end up with these massive hefty ones, which are nice and easy to use. For some things, for weaving in ends, for example, on finer knits, they can be quite annoying because they're just a bit too thick for precise work. However, with this, I'm not going to be super precise because I'm using a fairly heavy yarn, and so that's fine. So I'm going to be pulling my yarn through from the back, about a centimetre in from the edge of the cuff. Leave a bit of a tail that I'll weave in later. And so I'm going to be doing a blanket stitch. So rather than just whipping over the edge, I'm going to be catching my yarn tail each time. So I'm going in and just under the edge of the cuff. And you can see that's formed a loop around my working yarn there. And then I'll pull that sort of snug but not really tight. And then for each stitch I'm going to do one blanket stitch per knitted stitch, which will hopefully give the right sort of density of stitches. Of using a massive needle, but it's very easy to unthread and rethread. I'm going to try and keep this fairly even, but I'm not going to be obsessive about it. So what the blanket stitch does is it creates a little edge of stitches along the edge of the fabric, which seals off any raw edges quite nicely, which is why I have chosen this. You don't want to pull it really tight because then you end up with puckering. do want to pull it tight enough that your stitches are nice and dense and they're not going to get caught on things. So I'm going to carry on in this manner until I've got all the way around the cuff. I have now come full circle all the way around the cuff. You can see it's not the neatest thing in the world. However, that is a really nice strong edge. All of the loose bits, where were they? I've lost them. The bits where it was fraying, possibly there. The loose ends I've just encased in the stitches. I've not cut them back or anything. They probably will pop loose and then I will trim them. I'm not going to do that now because where possible I like to leave as much of the original in there unless it's making a mess. If I do need to trim it back, it won't really be a problem because now everything that's encased within the stitches isn't going to fray anymore because the stitches will be taking the brunt of the wear. And so that is going to be a really nice strong edge. I'm just going to finish off here. I've got my tail, and as much as a lot of people do not like knots anywhere on their knitwear, I find them incredibly useful. They are much stronger than pretty much everything else. In this situation, I don't need to worry about the yarn, the knot popping through to the right side or anything like that because of the way the stitches are lying. So I will just weave the end through the back of the stitches, not actually going through the fabric at all. And I'll weave that through a fair way. There. I'll trim that end off. And then rethread the end from the beginning. So the thing with these massive needles is you end up with needing a much longer tail to weave in because the needle's just so much longer, and so to be able to get it through it can be quite annoying. Right, there we go. So that's that end threaded in there. I'll trim that off and I'll use that to start the next cuff, and then I've got a little bit more of the yarn which I will use to finish those off. You can see it's flaring a little bit. That's just from where the fabric had stretched out. I'm going to wash this jumper soon. I tend not to wash my wool jumpers that frequently because mostly they don't need it. They tend not to accumulate smells and things. So I mostly wash them once they've got things spilled on them, which generally is a couple of times a year maybe. Depends if I'm cooking wearing it or not. I tend to be quite a messy cook. But yes, so that is a fairly straightforward way of sealing off an edge just to make it super durable. You can do that in a not contrasting yarn so that it'll just be sort of part of the fabric. You could also do it in a finer yarn and space the stitches closer together, which would end up with a more delicate finish. Like this is a fairly hefty edge, but because this is mostly a working jumper, I'm fine with that. So yes, let me know if that's something of interest. Have you tried an edge like this before? What's your preferred method for darning cuffs and other similar areas? Are there any other darning techniques you'd like to see if you have something that you want to fix and you want suggestions on how to fix it? I'd love to hear about that because I'm all for prolonging the life of knits and clothes in general. So yeah, leave a comment below if any of that is of interest to you. Thank you so much for spending a bit of time with me today. As always, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I would love to hear about what you are working on. Do leave a comment below. And if you're working on anything using my patterns or yarns, do join in the Out of the Dark Make Along. I'll put a link to the blog post about that and the Ravelry thread where you can join in. If you want to keep up with me in between podcast episodes, which are once a month, you can sign up to my newsletter where I make announcements about new products and new things. I have a few good things coming up soon, so that will be the best place to find out about them. You can follow me on Instagram, where I tend to post fairly regularly. You can go on my website and find me on Ravelry and Patreon. All of those links will be below. And until next time, bye bye.